the team here. David on Sundays, his wife on Mondays, and it's just delightful. David is a historian, teacher, and writer. He has taught in both high school and university classrooms for over 30 years. His primary focus has been American history, with an emphasis on helping children and young adults learn history and do well on standardized tests by working with primary sources and documents as well as textbooks. I'm also a history major out of UVA and did some work with primary sources, so I'm super stoked to have David here. He was born in New York City in 1941, holds his PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. David and his wife partner Diane have lived full-time on the island since 2006. And with that, I'm going to change over to the camera. And you should all see him out there in Zoom land, and you do. And why don't you go ahead and say something, David, and I'll confirm they can all hear you.
The topic tonight is, what is the difference between US history and critical race theory? Okay?
Yep, give me a thumbs up, Joe Allen, if you can hear him okay. Great, thank you, carry on.
Hi, Joellen. It's a small island.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the introduction, Carol. What is the difference between US history and critical race theory is a controversial and complex topic. It's overlaid with concern, with strong feelings, with fear. Are your children today, if white-skinned, responsible for racism and for discrimination in the past? Is that what is being taught in US high schools today, or at our high school on Orcas Island? And are there limits to parental control of schooling? Those are all questions that are in the air. And because the topic is so controversial, I'm going to ask for some ground rules and some expectations for this evening. First of all, the evening's goal is learning. We don't learn, I believe, we don't learn by saying something we already believe in. We don't learn by saying the same thing again louder, no matter how strong our feelings are. Learning comes from listening and thinking, not from repeating what you already know. So I'm suggesting for this evening, for this talk and the discussion that follows, a temporary suspension of disbelief in order to establish or to enable learning. The goal is not to show that you're right and somebody else is wrong. The goal is to see if there is something that might be said tonight here that you could learn from and that might be helpful to you. And if there isn't, then that's what happened this evening. And if there is, or something a little to think about, then so much the better. So what's the difference between US history and critical race theory? That means we need to look at both of these. And I'll start with US history. The very first question I want to raise is, where does history come from? In other words, how do we know what's a valid or true story of our country's past? History, with few exceptions, is researched and written. I think I'm going to move this. I'm not used to talking from the podium, but thank you anyway. It's researched and written by people who were not alive during the times that they were learning about. No one today, for example, is alive in 1898 when Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders helped conquer Cuba for the United States. Or in 1858, when the Supreme Court passed the Dred Scott decision, which ruled that enslaved blacks, actually all blacks, but enslaved blacks were property, not persons before the law, and therefore was in violation of the Constitution to pass any laws limiting slavery or prohibiting its spread. Nor was anyone alive in 1565 for the establishment of the first European settlement in what became the United States in St. Augustine, Florida. So that's why historians in finding out the story of our national past rely on primary sources. Primary sources are written documents or pictures or artifacts, any material that was created at the same time that it's describing. For example, newspapers or journals, medical records, pictures and photographs, government documents, personal letters or notes, recordings when available, church records. That's how we know that the number of brides who went to the altar already pregnant in Puritan New England, colonial Puritan New England, was higher than the number of brides who went to the altar pregnant in New England in the 20th century. Church records in the colonial period included both marriage and baptismal dates. So it's pretty easy to figure out the percentage who were pregnant and who were not. For the most part, learning from documents and primary sources works very well. But sometimes there are problems about the past, learning about the past from primary sources, which have to be faced by historians. For example, okay. Oops. Pass out some of these things. I think we've got more than enough. We can pass those back. This, does this show up okay on the Zoom?
And I'm sharing it.
Oh, okay.
The electronic version.
Good. So this is a primary source that was created by a group of Europeans who came, a small group, who came over here in the late 16th century, over here being what's now the United States, probably what's now the Carolinas or North Florida. It's not clear. They came purposely in order to create a book that they could then sell in Europe, where lots of people were interested in what to them was a new world. They observed what the Native Americans were doing. They wrote about it. They drew these pictures in order to help people, well before cameras, to help people understand what was happening in among these, to Europeans, new and strange people. So here we have a primary source of a picture from people who were there, showing how the natives at that time went deer hunting. They put on the hollowed out deer skins. They put their heads inside the deer head. They carried their bow and arrow or their spears with them. And according to this primary source, by doing that, they were able to get within a few feet of the deer. Now, this is an example of a couple of things, and one of them is that when historians do try to figure out what's happening in the past, they look at internal evidence, internal to the document. And I'm not sure what your reaction is, but when I showed this to high school students in a number of different public high schools in Providence, Rhode Island, they almost universally had the same reaction. And that was that this couldn't be possible. You could not get that close to a deer, a human being, just by putting deer skin on. The deer are particularly sensitive, especially to smell. And there's no way, just by putting a deer skin over them, that they could get that close to the living deer and then hunt them just a few feet across the stream. So they doubted the authenticity of the source. Now, we have no way of knowing now for sure whether it's accurate or not. I tend to doubt it as well. We'd have to assume, and I don't know, never seen anything that suggests this, that deer in 400 or 500 years ago were so different from the deer we know today. And in the primary source, they look very similar, but so different from the deer we know today that they were so insensitive to noise, to human smell, to the danger of being hunted and being killed, that you could actually walk up within 2 or 3 feet of them and they wouldn't know the difference simply because you had a deer skin on. So one point from this is that historians use internal evidence from the source itself to determine whether or not the source is accurate or valid. And this one, its own evidence casts doubt on it. But even more important, as far as I'm concerned, is the explanation that I just gave is an example of the extent to which there's no way historians or any of us, whenever we're alive, if we're trying to understand an accurate version of the past, a version that's valid and that has integrity, there's no way we can understand anything about that past without actually thinking about it from what we know ourselves about the world today. Because that's what I just did. That's what the high school students did. I think when you look at this, it's a natural thing to do if you're looking at it seriously and critically. How could this be possible? We don't think it could be. Why don't we think it could be? Because that's not what we know of the world today. So our sense of the present, of what the world is like now, according to us, always influences how we understand the past. What we see as reasonable or possible now influences how we understand, as I said, primary sources from over 400 years ago. And that creates a dilemma. Here's an example from the history of writing about Black American history. Most up-to-date information in the 1940s and 50s, and I was in high school. I was in elementary school in the 40s and high school in the 50s. Most up-to-date information from the most experienced, respected historians of slavery in the United States at the time concluded that because the Negro, and that's what Blacks were called then by, in general, Negro tended to laziness. The Negro was slow to learn. The Negro liked to laugh and sing. The Negro was not responsible or dependable. So enslavement, these historians wrote, was really the best solution for them. And Negroes knew that, the historians said. Negroes generally were satisfied or pleased to be enslaved. They understood this was a good world for them. That's why they appreciated their masters. The masters, these historians wrote, treated them kindly, made sure they had food every day, and adequate housing, and presents at Christmas time, and the safe plantation, the place to live where they could be protected. Well, these conclusions from the 1940s and 50s have been shown over and over again by historians working in the last 60 years or so to be false, to be inaccurate, to be grossly misleading to the reality of American slavery before the Civil War. And what we see here again is the power of our own current beliefs to influence how we see our country's past. Why was the history of slavery written in the 1940s so distorted? The historians who wrote those accounts were men of integrity. They worked honestly. They worked with primary sources. They worked as a community of historians, talking about each other's work, trying to do what they find, to see what they find, try to make what they find to be an accurate history which had integrity and was valid. But they uncovered still an unvalid version of American history. Because these men, and they were mostly men in the 1940s and 1950s, were largely white, upper middle class, even patrician, they used only those sources that made sense to them. That is, supported the sources that supported their own heartfelt belief, their certainty that Black-skinned people were and are inferior. Why has accurate history of American slavery changed so much in the past 60 years or so? The reason is because the class, race, gender, age, and personal experiences of historians has changed. The past has not changed, the historians have. As a personal note, I can remember in the early 1970s as a young historian, at one of the colleges, a fairly well-known historian of the Middle Ages came as a speaker. And I was invited to attend because I was an historian at a neighboring university. And the guest lecturer before dinner told us what he thought was a funny story. One of his graduate students had proposed to do his research, his dissertation, on anti-Semitism in Europe in the Middle Ages. And this eminent professor laughed, literally laughed out loud. How silly could he be? How laughable could that be to think that was a legitimate topic? Early 1970s, anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. That's who that person was. As a young historian who was present at the time, who happened to be Jewish, I found it neither silly nor laughable. It sounded like an important topic not to be overlooked. What was the difference? The difference was my background as a historian, the age difference, religious or ethnic difference, perspective, approach to life. There are other accounts of a diary that was left by a midwife in what's now Maine and New Hampshire. At that time, it was all Maine. And she traveled, it was ignored by the white male historians because it had no valuable information in it. It was just a woman's diary of being a midwife. And that was not important to history as far as they were concerned. It took a woman historian, and I actually don't know the actual time it occurred, but she mined this diary and found out not only a lot about how babies were born and women's health and male health and travel, because she had to travel to different places, but she also acted as a medical care person. And so by her diary, this historian, a woman, was able to trace the spread of viruses and diseases throughout that period from that diary. So from her perspective, from her opening up a whole different definition of what counted as history to be looked at, she was able to uncover information which became important, period, especially as a history of medicine and disease. So I want to say from this that just like physics or biology or phys ed, all historical understanding is constantly being revised. You wouldn't want your school teacher to teach the children the physics of 60 or 70 years ago, before big screen TV or the internet or cell phones or intercontinental ballistic missiles or satellites or Google Maps. And you wouldn't want PE of 60 or 70 years ago either, when girls and young women couldn't play organized sports. No girls basketball, no softball for girls, no volleyball. Such activities were considered unsuitable for girls and young women 60 and 70 years ago. That has changed. So why expect your school, the nation's schools, to teach the history of 60 or 70 years ago, when Blacks and people of color and women, Black and white, and gays and lesbians, people in the trades, were largely ignored? The important point is that all history is revisionist history. That's the only kind of history there is. Lots of people like to say when there's a change, oh, that's revisionist history. It's not the true story. That may make sense to a lot of people. As an historian, I don't think it's an accurate, helpful way to describe things. And I think if you asked virtually any historian who's been trained in the last 20 or 25 years, that person would say the same thing. There is no such thing, never has been, and never can be, one uncontested, objective, true account of our nation. I have a daughter who's a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. One time we were talking on the phone some years ago, and she was saying objectivity for historians is about as important as fish are for historians. And I said, how are fish important for historians? And she said, exactly. You want to work with integrity, you want to work honestly, you want to work with precision, you want to work with all the available primary sources, you want to make sure you're not ignoring sources which would contradict what you believe, you want to see yourself as an honest member of a community of historians in your field, all of whom are attempting to get at some kind of accurate version, a version with integrity. But that doesn't make it objective. Same as going back to the example of the professor in the 1970s. He was working honestly when he thought anti-Semitism in the middle of age was a silly topic. And I was being honest when, I didn't say anything at the time, but I was being honest when I thought, doesn't seem silly to me. It seems like a very valid, worthwhile topic. So that's the difference. It's not, revisionist doesn't mean, it means that there's no accurate, true one account of our nation's history. The only way that could happen is if we're overtaken by an authoritarian government which determines what can and cannot be taught. And then we no longer have accurate or honest history. Which brings us to the next question. What is critical race theory? Critical race theory focuses on the difference between two quite different ways of looking at race and racism. Who is most responsible for problems like inadequate housing or crime, hunger, poverty, lack of jobs, lack of access to education, medical services, or extremely important, the ability for a family to accumulate family wealth over time, so that the next generation can be slightly better off than the previous and so on. On the one hand, some folks say that the problem that Black people face are largely the result of a lack of their own effort. In other words, it's a problem of how individuals behave. The reason some groups, like Blacks, never seem to get ahead economically is because as a group, they lack gumption, they lack effort, they don't take the initiative, they haven't got the energy to succeed, they aren't particularly dependable when it comes to work situations. And these are the classic American characteristics that are keys to success. On the other hand, critical race theory, when looking at race and racism, emphasizes the larger American political and social structure. So several examples here can make clear what critical race theory means by political and social structure, which is conceptual, an abstract term. I've chosen each example to illustrate a different political or social structure that, according to critical race theory, is said to influence race and racism more than individual effort. Why is it that some neighborhoods, especially wealthier neighborhoods, throughout our history have been primarily white? Why is it that warehouses or processing plants or factories are not found in wealthier white neighborhoods? One reason that critical race theory points to is that local zoning boards set up zoning regulations so that nothing unpleasant can be located in certain neighborhoods. That's an example of policy setting role of local governments. I don't think, I mean, you may think this is right, you may think this is positive, you may think this is a valid government function, you may think it's wrong, it goes against the American way. What I'm saying is, according to critical race theory, this is an example of how a policy or structure of government, of local government, influences race and racism in America today. It's not either, I'm not making a judgment of it, I'm presenting it. Which is not to say I don't have a judgment of it. Another reason is that real estate agencies and their agents would not show houses in wealthier neighborhoods or in white neighborhoods to people of color, even when those people could afford to live there and even when they wanted to live there. So that's an example of a policy being set by local businesses, by corporations, and by their employees. Another reason is the interstate highway system, which was begun under President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. Now, city planners, as before the interstate highway, city planners had to choose where those routes, the blue superhighways, would take when they went through the city. And in fact, how they would divide the city. And most often, these highways were built in ways that separated primarily Black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color and poor neighborhoods from white neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods. And that was done purposely in order to create the separation so that the highway would not go through the area that the city planners saw as a wealthier and mostly white area that they wanted to preserve. So again, now we've got city government working with the federal government because the interstate highway system paid 90% by the federal government. Another example, many neighborhood associations would pass convents which legally prohibited sales to Blacks or people of color or to Jews. These were legally binding. If you bought a house in this neighborhood, you had to sign papers. Part of the purchase of the house made it illegal for you to sell to these groups. That neighborhood had to stay restricted And that was the term that was used. And is less common today, but is still not uncommon. Or it still exists. So that's a policy and a structure created by local organizations and their attorneys. Another reason is that Blacks were denied access to national government programs that backed mortgages, especially after World War II, making them affordable for the first time to working people and people in the trades. This happened in the late 1940s. That's a federal policy. Those were not available to Blacks in general. The Armed Forces of the United States, an avenue for many people that many young people choose as a way of having a career and an advancement and a stable, constructive role in the United States for themselves. The Armed Forces of the United States remained segregated by skin color until after the end of World War II, which is 1945. When Social Security was first enacted, I'm assuming that some in the audience and some on Zoom may in fact be, I'm at the point where I get Social Security. I think there are others of a similar age. When it was first enacted in the 1930s, it was purposely designed by New Deal legislators to exclude most Black people. And they did that by excluding certain occupations, which were primarily filled by people of color and Black people. So that's another decision, that's a policy that critical race theory would point to. And the final example is I'd like to give is decisions made by corporations and their advertising firms. For instance, in the past year or so, I've noticed, and you may have noticed as well, that magazine covers and newspaper stories include many, many more pictures of Black people. As a personal example, I've noticed that the New Yorker magazine, which is available here in the library every week, has had many covers for the past quite a few months that feature Black people, their faces and clothing, in fact, almost exclusively. First, I thought, looking at these, what is going on here? And then I thought, well, for the first 79 years of my life, the New Yorker covers have been white people, and more white people. So it's me who looks surprised, who feels surprised, when now they're Black people for months at a time. Critical race theory would say it's harder to stand up for yourself if you feel you don't belong here in the first place, that you're not included. So these are all examples of what critical race theory means when it stresses the structural handicaps and the policies that Black people are born into. What critical race theory is not. It's not new. The programs in graduate schools and the emphasis that's been given in the press and in culture wars is fairly new. But its ideas and conclusions are not recently established. For example, more than 50 years ago, James Baldwin wrote in his book, The Fire Next Time, and I quote, "Now there is simply no possibility of a real change in the Negro situation without the most radical and far-reaching changes in the American political and social structure," end quote. That's a one sentence. That's the heart of critical race theory. Nor is critical race theory focused on criticizing people. Something else that we hear quite often. The critical in critical race theory means scholars and researchers must look at their own subject, race and racism, and their own work critically. That is in depth, carefully, thoughtfully, as a community that wants to work honestly and integrity. That's what it means to work critically. It's not aimed at individuals. I would say that the furor over critical race theory today comes from its use as a catch-all phrase to cover the changes in our knowledge base in American history over the past 50 years or so. That change has broadened US history so that our nation's story now includes people who were left out previously. Blacks, American Indians, other people of color, but also women, white and black, people working in the trades, craftspeople, drivers, nurses, librarians. The list could be extended. Could be extended considerably. Critical race theory is labeled by many today as the agent responsible for this dramatic change in our perspective on what counts as history. To my mind, this is misleading. It gives critical race theory a major role, even the leading role. It's more accurate to say it's an example of the changes that have occurred in our historical knowledge base over the past half century. In other words, critical race theory is a product, not the cause of changes in what young people are learning today. How are American history and critical race theory different? That's the wrong question, even though it's my question for this talk. It doesn't get us anywhere. And why is that? Because critical race theory is simply one branch among many, many others that have developed over the past 50 years. It's not the tree itself, it's but a branch. And it's not what's taught in our schools. I'll give the last word to Kathy Collister, a now retired American history teacher who taught at Orcas Public Schools for many, many years. When writing about what she taught in a classroom in response to someone writing about critical race theory, Kathy said, and I quote, "I taught knowledge." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. I'd like to open it up to the floor here. We have a question in the audience here, and then for those of you on Zoom, if you please use the chat feature to indicate any questions you may have. And yes.
Can I say one more thing? This is a form of an apology. I'm going to sit down. And the reason I did more reading than speaking is because I found that at age 80, it wasn't as easy for me to follow my train of thought as I went along. So it would have been more smooth, I'm sure, the other way, but that's the reason.
That's just fine. I'm going to make sure to go lower so that we're not looking at the top of your head. Lovely.
Fireside chat.
Okay, we have a question here.
Well, this is just about, I wondered if Kathy was there because I was thinking of her the whole time you were
Yes,
talking.
she is.
Hi, Kathy. Jane Alden. Yeah, everything you said is.
Can you hear me? Hello, thank you.
Wonderful.
Hi, David.
Clear and informative. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well done, David. Excellent talking. It was smooth. Joe Massey. And Diane Craig, thanks you very much for the presentation. Well, I'm going to break the ice. I have a question. Some would say that there are the groups of people who suffer due to systematic policies, Irish, Italian, and how would you speak to that?
Well, I would say it's a very good point, and it's if we had lots of time for different lectures. I think most people today don't know. Maybe I shouldn't begin like that. Well, I have begun like that. I think most people today don't know that in the 19th century, the Irish were called Black Irish when they first immigrated to this country. And that's not because people thought they were actually black skinned. It's because they were thought of as being so low in the socioeconomic hierarchy that they were treated as just above black people. I think people also don't know that the amount of, well, I want to present also the amount of prejudice and discrimination and violence that was turned on Catholics and Catholic churches. Catholic churches were burned by mobs. They were attacked. There were newspapers in the 19th century which actually ran accounts as valid and true, that there were underground passages between the quarters that held the priests and nunneries, and the nunneries were actually used as prostitutes for the priests, and that was their primary function. And those were published newspapers in the 1840s and 50s. So I agree completely with your question. Critical race theory, I actually don't know how broad this expanse is, but the number of people who were different types of people who could be included in that list, in addition to Blacks and American Indians and people of color, is enormous. And I think if we realize that today, at least it helps me to understand better what's going on and why I need to pay attention to it, in addition to knowing that we're all Americans and all fellow human beings. My 4 grandparents, when they arrived here in the early 20th century, were labeled by the US government as not white. They were all immigrants, and their papers say Hebrew. And the reason they were all Jewish, and the reason for that is because during that time period, the government did not see official policy. Jews were not considered white. Jews did not become white in this country, quote unquote, until the beginning and during World War II, and well, maybe late 30s, and then after World War II. I was born in New York City in 1941. If I had been, the immigration service was slower than New York City was to make the changeover from Hebrew to white on a birth certificate. If I had been an infant arriving from Europe on the exact day that I was born, April 13, 1941, I would have been labeled as Hebrew, as non-white, because the immigration service hadn't changed over yet. So yes, I agree. Thank you.
Another question in the room? Anyone?
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to make sure I understand, because I've been thinking the word critical meant criticize. It does not mean that. Is that what you're saying? It means looking at with focus and care or something.
Well, it's for instance, if you were to write something and you asked Diane to critique it for you,
Yes,
you're asking her to be a friendly critic
right.
and to give you feedback that could be helpful for you to make it better.
Okay,
So the critical and critical race theory refers to that. They are critically looking
I get it.
at race and racism. That doesn't mean that that there can be people who practice or believe in critical race theory or work in that are also critical in their own opinions or their own feelings or conclusions about people or governments or policies that they feel support race and racism.
But they aren't hand in hand, right? They don't go together automatically.
That's right, they don't go, well,
In other words, critical doesn't mean, it
No.
means looking carefully, basically, with intelligence.
right, it doesn't mean to criticize white
Okay.
children today
That's great.
or white people today.
Okay.
That's a conclusion
Yeah.
that many people who believe in critical race theory
come
reach.
to, yes.
I never have actually heard that term, critical race theory, until maybe a couple of years ago. It seems like I've seen it in the paper more and being brought up as a thing that I thought it was some kind of a crazy wacko idea that was being conjured up, like it was something that wasn't really valid. But I don't know, like you probably know all the things that are popping up in the news and you read it here and there as a statement, including those words. And I don't know, do you think that it's being used in a good way or a valid way? Or is it something that's being used to stir up the pot or being, I don't know how to say it, but I just felt like it wasn't really a way to uncover truth.
For me to speak to that would be my personal politics and feelings and
Okay,
leave the field of my expertise. I do know, as I said, I feel very firmly and strongly, as I said in my talk,
Mhm.
that critical race theory is getting more credit or responsibility or attention for what in fact is really a change in the nature of historical knowledge over the last 60 years. Just like physics has changed,
Mhm.
physical education has changed, chemistry, biology. So
So it doesn't mean it's more factual, it's just changed due to the people discovering or announcing their views or their findings.
American history is more factual, only in the sense, like the story I told about the woman who used the diary of the of the midwife in the 17th century,
Mm.
actually, I'm not even sure it was 17th or 18th century New England. So it's more factual in the sense that there's now a much broader range of materials
Mm.
that historians look at and think are important.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean to say that the historians who wrote the distorted view of slavery when they were writing in the 1940s and 50s and earlier, their accounts were factual also.
Mm.
They just only focused on what they saw as important.
I know. Mhm.
But the other question about the role critical race theory plays today, I don't think is, it's not an historical question.
Okay.
Sorry.
We have a question here from Diane. As historians, how do we counter the suggestion that CRT shouldn't be taught because it may make some children uncomfortable?
Well, I know that's a good question. I know what the American Historical Association does. That's the major professional association for historians in the United States. They do things like pass motions and write letters. They're a national institutional organization. They poll members. They, for instance, would write to archives about releasing papers. They've written, I know already, they've gotten together papers and arguments to send to Texas and to Virginia for the kind of history that they're presenting or for arguing about affecting schools. I know other education organizations are doing the same. I feel that's what I'm doing today. If other people, if part of the learning you've taken away this evening from the conversation is that, in fact, aside from the question of whether critical race theory is being presented accurately, if you've taken away the basic understanding that what's changed is the nature of historical knowledge. History is a discipline. And like every other academic discipline, its knowledge changes over time. I mean, go home and look at your large screen TV or your cell phone. And so I think that that's the kind of thing that historians can do as historians, is talk about accurate history and talk about what it means to advocate for teaching a history that's accurate, thorough, full, has integrity, and is inclusive, and is presented in a way which is not intended, is not presented as a charge, but as an account of the country we live in. That's what I think historians can do.
The question of that?
I've been having a lot of trouble integrating critical race theory with historiography, and I don't see it. I see it more as a sociological writer on historical method. It's been difficult for me to look at them as two systems in opposition.
Yeah, I don't see them as two systems. I think the answer to what's the difference between critical race theory and history, US history, is that there isn't any, they're the same. Critical race theory is, I know much more about history and how history works than I do about critical race theory. My understanding is critical race theory became the same thing that James Baldwin said more than 50 years ago. But it became first with a group of lawyers who wanted to say, how can we work on ending race and racism by attacking structure and policies which make things more difficult, make race and racism more difficult. And then became graduate programs for students who want to study. The graduate programs are women's history, in US history, and environmental history, and Chinese history, and medieval history. So this became a subset of graduate programs at the universities. And what it is, as I said, I think even saying it's a branch on the tree gives it more credit. If the tree is history, it's really a bud. But as your question suggests, the big thing that's happened that I wasn't willing to speak my own opinion on, because I want to speak from the area that I've been asked to speak about, my own expertise as an historian. It's really been blown up into something major that is purposely designed nefariously to make white-skinned people feel guilty. And from an historical perspective, history is purposely designed to be more truthful, objective, have integrity, and be more inclusive. So you're not only writing from the perspective, which is a valid perspective. There's nothing wrong with American political history, obviously, which focuses on presidents and legislation and wars and diplomatic treaties. I know diplomatic history is not like that today, it's changed. But nonetheless, I'm not judging one field over another. I'm saying that critical race theory is a small subdivision of the changes that have happened in the knowledge base of US history over the past 50 years. Does that answer your question?
Pretty much.
Well, pretty much is pretty good.
From my training, that I have a degree in history, I'm a left-leaning, I'm more influenced by Marxian historians. I see that as kind of the cake under the icing of critical race theory. So I guess I'm just more comfortable. I identify with that more than traditional history, where it was the generals and who crossed the Potomac when, which tends mostly to be chronology rather than history.
When I was in high school, and believe me, not a good student, one of the things I remember is that I used to have the thermostat theory of history. I didn't know anyone in the winter who cared as much about the things we were learning in US history classes or world history as people cared about where the thermostat was set in their home or their apartment. So even then, as a 16, 17-year-old, it didn't make sense to me. I also want to say that I agree with you that that part of history that focuses on taking a structural and policy approach to race and racism is more left radical than historians generally. And it has to be, because what it's focusing on is government structure and large policies. So it's not looking at individuals and saying, this is the United States, the land of individuals, of freedom, this is how we work, this is how we became great. It's saying there are government programs that can change the way we live, that influences how we live now, that influences who succeeds and who doesn't, and how that happens. Who gets educated, who doesn't get educated in the same way. And that tends to be a Marxist or socialist perspective. It's saying more emphasis on the role that the government can play and should play in influencing the life of the citizens of people who live in the country.
We have a question from Joellen, and then we'll go back to Diane. And Joellen, I'm sorry, my speaker's not working, so can you type your question in? I know that's not ideal. No. Or, if you click the little chat guy down at the bottom, on the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a little chat icon. If you click that, you'll be able to type in your question. And meanwhile, while you do that, let me go back to Diane, who wrote, what are your thoughts on the increasing influence parents are having on education curricula?
Well, again, I'd love to not answer as an historian, but I'll answer as an historian. I think that it's excessive. And again, I use the example of physics. Would you tell your child's physics teacher that they're not to teach the physics that they're teaching because you think it's detrimental? You don't want your child using a cell phone or understanding how it works, or you don't want your child learning Einsteinian theory because it's crazy, or you think the earth is flat, you're a flat earther. I don't think parents have the right to set the curriculum. The parents have the right to have input, but they don't have the right to set the curriculum. They do have the right, the way things stand now, to home educate, or if they can afford to move their children to to a private school or to a community school. But the public schools are designed to actually legally to provide education for the general population. And they do that by focusing on, in each field, theoretically, those who know their field and teach that to the teachers. And then there are state boards of education, curriculum guides, there's all sorts of structure. And parents have some input, but neither in history nor in physics nor in PE do I think they should have the final word. And as I said at the beginning, one thing I've learned for myself, as well as my own experience working with groups in university and in high schools over about 35 years, is that learning comes from listening and thinking, not from trying to prove that you're right. So yelling or saying it louder. I can remember high school kids, my last teaching job in a public school in Virginia. I taught mostly juniors and seniors. And they wanted to have a tennis match back and forth. No, this is right. No, I said this. No, you didn't mean that. And I wouldn't let them. I told them when we had a discussion, the rule was that they could say, of course I was a teacher, so it's different than being in a public forum. But the rule in the class was, you can say what you want once on that topic. And then if somebody responds, you can only respond back if you think they've misunderstood what you said. And then you could explain what you said again. But the goal isn't to show you're right in a high school classroom. The goal isn't to prove you know best. I mean, maybe it was for me when I was a junior in high school, but as the teacher, however many decades later, my goal is that, just like Kathy says, knowledge. I'm there to present knowledge, not to have a screaming match. So that's I think of that because of the reports about parents coming to town meetings and shouting down other speakers and not allowing the speakers to have their say and closing down the meeting. I don't think that's helpful.
We have a question here from Joe Allen. First, thank you, David. I think one problem is the word critical. It is unfortunate that people are reactive to that word and don't seem to get beyond that. I appreciate your clear explanation of what that word means. I have to say, for me, the big takeaway is that critical race theory is the product of our improving perception and knowledge of our own history. It's not, what was the other thing you said? It's not a cause, it's actually the product of. Yeah, that was helpful for me. More questions in the room? How about online? Anyone else online want to ask a question? Yes.
When did this become, has it always been called that since, what is critical race theory has just come to my attention over the last couple of years. Why has it got that name? What is it? I mean, I know what it is from what you said. It sounds like it's an investigation into a kind of way of investigating a part of history that we have. That's what it seems like to me, right? Is that right? Am I right? Because all of a sudden it sounds anti everything to people. And I don't know how that happened. Can you?
Well, now I speak less as an historian and more just as the same boat we're all in. It seems to me that it's become a political weapon or a political symbol that's used to raise issues that are important to people.
Which have nothing to do with what it means, actually. Is that right?
I wouldn't say it has nothing to do with it, but I wouldn't say, I would say, like many things in the so-called culture wars, it's hard to get at how much is exaggerated. Well, it's important to look at what might be exaggerated. Or, for instance, if we say, as this questioner asked, that yes, there has to be a socialist or Marxist underpinning to this, because they're talking about using government programs. They're not talking about as much about the role of the individual. If you go to that, to say that they're all communists trying to undermine the United States, I don't think that's a valid conclusion. It's a step too far. And I think that's what's happening now with critical race theory. Is that clear?
It's still hard for me, those three words, critical race theory. Is it critical race study? Would make more sense to me, I don't,
I don't have an answer for that.
but you see it clearly and I don't.
I see it the way I see it, and it seems clear to me.
Can you say it one more time? I mean, critical race theory, as I understand it from what you said, and I could be wrong, is a form of studying the history of race. Is that right?
Race and racism.
Racism. It is not about criticizing it. It's a way of studying it. Critical is a word related to the study.
Right. And it's a critique of what they're studying. They work critically. They're being critical of racism and race theory and trying to understand where it comes from and how it works. They're not exaggerating, making things up. They're trying to work with integrity and objectivity. And I need to add, that does not mean that there are people who are involved with critical race theory who aren't critical
Yeah,
of different things that are happening in the United States today.
but it's
But
not,
critical race theory itself is not inherently critical.
right, it's not implied in the word critical.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
David,
And doesn't critical race theory include intersectionality?
What the heck is that?
It's not just race, right? It's age, sex, social,
Yeah, right.
socioeconomic level, all of that.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, it sounds like you know more about critical race theory than I do. I know about it in the context of history. But that certainly would make sense to me.
And am I right that the term was first used in reconsidering graduate programs and histories in university settings? I mean, this is an academic, the term had an
Yeah,
academic origin.
I see.
Is that correct? That's what I
That's my understanding.
understood.
Its pre-origin might have been with lawyers who were trying to figure out, but as a university program, critical race theory is a program in universities. right?
Which lawyers study, actually, yes, or can, that's-
Lawyers could study, yeah, I think.
it's not just lawyers who study this.
No, not anymore, right.
Okay.
It's now a scholarly, right? It's now also a scholarly enterprise.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what department it belongs to.
We have a
Lingerie.
few comments that may help. Diane says the interesting part of that description is that generally race is a human construct and not a natural occurrence. Which is a
Yes.
whole other meaning.
Yes.
And then William Weisinger says, would it be fair to call it analytic race theory and not condemnatory race theory?
Oh,
And Jens would like to speak. Sadly, Jens, my speaker's not working, so you need to type what you want to say.
Well, while Jens is typing, right, I like analytical race theory, but it's not up to us to rename it.
but that's helpful.
That's helpful for understanding it. I also left this out because it's so difficult for many people to accept. But now that it's been presented by one of the comments on the Zoom, as far back as the 1950s, an anthropologist by the name of Ashley Montague, who was writing for the United Nations, wrote that the idea of race is racism. In other words, there are biologically, genetically, there are no races that can be defined specifically. The major thing that Black people have in common genetically is black or dark skin color. That's the only thing that's universal, or the foremost thing that's universal. There's no way genetically, and I invite you to ask someone who knows much more about this than me as an historian. But racism is a social construct. Race is a social construct.
I believe it, and I believe from what I've read that it's based on the migrations of peoples that have placed them on the planet in relationship to the sun.
Latitude,
Latitude,
Latitude?
as opposed to longitude? I don't.
Longitude.
Latitude.
doesn't,
Yes,
it's the same
absolutely.
level of sun,
Exactly.
so latitude.
This was stunning to me, but I recently read this and I am stunned. There is no race. Is it a made-up construct, just as you said?
It's a social construct, which doesn't mean that, that race does have power. The idea of race in the world today is extremely powerful as a concept that exists and is applied. But genetically or biologically, there's no such
No,
thing
it's
as
a
race.
made, yes, that's right.
Eileen Battle Crumpet says, thank you, David, so informative, and thank you to our fabulous library folks. Oh, thanks. And Jens, I'm so sorry about the speaker. I wish that we could get your comment into the chat. Are there others out there who want to type a little message? Or any others in the room?
Where do you see this going? Is there any way, what does it look like? You can't tell. Doesn't look good. I
Yeah,
don't think,
historians
does it?
don't predict.
So they don't?
Well, I don't think what they know is
But
gives them
not
the
being a
ability to
historian,
predict.
do you have an idea about it, thought about it?
If you want to talk after we're finished,
Oh, okay,
but not as an historian, just as a person.
okay.
All right, well, we thought this was gonna be about an hour and we're about at the hour mark, so unless there are any other questions out there, I'll say thank you again, David, for coming. Thanks to all of
Thank
you
you.
for
Thank
attending.
you.
I did put 2 quick questions in there. How'd you learn about this program and would you recommend it to a friend? And if you could reply, that would be great. Diane says a wonderful presentation. Thank you, and thanks to our library.
Yes, thank you,
How
How
Carol.
do we do this, putting in our stuff about, you want us to comment about?
You guys can just tell me.
Oh,
How'd you find out about those events?
I saw one.
On the newsletter or the website?
Yeah.
Website.